the feature that I am going to talk about this evening. And it is, in my family, it features very heavily in an almost spiritual way, by which I mean it is the most spectacular part of England, and the wall, which we will talk about, sits there dominating the landscape as it has done for nearly 2,000 years. What we are going to look at this evening is Hadrian's Wall, and we're going to look particularly at what Britain was like at the time that this wall was built. We're going to look at the man himself, the Emperor Hadrian. We're going to look at how, why, and where the wall was built. We are going to look at what it was like for the soldiers who lived on the wall. We're going to look at what it was like for the ordinary British people who lived by the wall. And then we're going to look at some of the lasting legacy, the memories of the wall, and how it features in the local community today. Now, in order to keep you interested, and I can't believe I have to say that, I have included in this presentation some facts that I have made up. All right? So, at the end, I shall reveal them, and if you spot them, I'm going to ask people to shout out what they think was not true. Mr. Scott, history teachers are not allowed to participate in that competition. Well, on the other hand, maybe you can, and we can have a little battle between us. Okay, let's just start by having a look at the wall. think that rather atmospheric film gives you a feel of the wildness of that area, and that is today. Imagine it 2,000 years ago. Now, I want to just give you a little bit of a flavour about Britain in the year 100 or so CE, so about 1900 years ago. Britain was not the Britain that we know today. There was no England, there was no Wales, there was no Scotland, there was no Ireland. The Romans had a name for the island, and the island was called Britannia. The area that we know as Scotland was called Caledonia. The area that we call Ireland was called Hibernia. And the people who lived there were Celtic. And this is a very ancient and mysterious people populating Western and some parts of Northern Europe 2,000 years ago. They lived largely in small communities based on farming. This would have been considered a pretty large community in Celtic culture. So there were no towns or cities as we understand them. They were very tribal. Here you see a map. You can see Hibernia over on the left there, Caledonia, and you can see that what we would call England and Wales is divided up into tribal areas. These were groups of people who had strong cultural connections with each other, but were very much in conflict and competition with the tribes around them. So, for example, the Iceni tribe down here in what is now East Anglia, famous, as I will mention in a little while. The tribe that I come from here, the Brigantes. I like to think I am a true Brigantian warrior, but probably I'll find that that isn't the case. And up in Caledonia, a group of tribes who collectively would often be referred to as the Picts. Confusingly, the Scots, people who live in Scotland, originated in Ireland, just to confuse things. So this was the Britain that existed 2,000 years ago. None of the cities that we know in England, or Wales and Scotland today existed. None of them. Certainly not with the names that we know. So I want you to try and picture a community based around these small villages, tribal in nature, and yet sophisticated. On the top left, this is a golden torque. It would fit around the neck of a king or a queen, and it is an incredibly fine piece of metalwork. Beneath that, you see a Celtic shield, a warrior's shield. Again, intricate metal working. And on the right-hand side, representations of Celtic warriors. Now, history is always written by the winners. The losers often get written out of history. So much of what we know about the Celts is from Roman literature. And they were very insulting about the Celts because they wanted to show them as lesser than their civilization. One of the things, for example, that appalled the Romans when they came across the Celts They had beards. A Roman would not be seen with a beard, certainly not in the 1st century. They fought bare-chested, and often they painted their faces. These were barbarians. They were not civilized people in the Roman way of thinking. Okay, so that is Britain before the Romans. Now I have a question. If anybody would like to tell me, who was the first Roman emperor? Anybody know? Put your hand up if you think you know. Mr. Scott, keep quiet. Anybody want to have a guess? Somebody shouted Julius Caesar. No, he wasn't. It is the... I knew somebody would say Julius Caesar, I'm sorry. He is probably the most famous Roman that people would be able to recall, Julius Caesar. He was not, in fact, ever the emperor. He was, in 44 BC, so that's 2,070 years ago, he was declared a dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, a title that I suspect Donald Trump would not mind having. Now, Julius Caesar was, well, he was a ruthless man. He was a glory hunter. And in 55 BC, he was fighting the Gauls. And the Gauls were what we would call French. They were people living in France. And he was fighting a long and really bloody war against the Gauls to bring them under Roman control. He was also eyeing up total power in Rome. And across the channel from France, from Gaul, was the mysterious island of Britannia, a land of magic and wizards and darkness. And Julius Caesar saw an opportunity, which was to go across to Britain, fight a few battles, steal some treasure and some slaves, and then come back to France. And he did it twice. He did it in 55 and 54 BC. But on neither occasion had he any intention of staying there. He was writing a story for himself and then went back to Rome to seize total power before being assassinated by his rivals. So Julius Caesar puts Britain on the Roman map. But it's another 100 years before the Romans return. And they return under this man, Emperor Claudius. And Claudius, although he didn't fight in the actual invasion, he arrived once the fighting was over, bringing with him some elephants, which he led in triumph into the capital village of the tribe that had been defeated. And in this representation, there he is, taking the triumph, his soldiers praising him, and in the background, look at that, a Celtic village representing the barbarians who had been brought under his control. For the next 90 or so years, the Romans gradually brought the south of England and Wales into their control. And it wasn't without trouble, because firstly, they had to come across this group of people, the Druids, an ancient religious group who lived in Wales, whom the Romans thought practiced human sacrifice. And despite the brutality of the Romans, to them, human sacrifice was appalling. They were quite happy to slaughter each other in the Colosseum, but human sacrifice was another thing. So the Druids ended up fighting a long war against the Romans, which ended up and the island of Anglesey in the very northwest of Wales. The Druids on the island thought they could hold the Romans off, but the Roman soldiers found a way of getting across the sea and slaughtering the Druids to a man and a woman. As that was happening, several hundred miles away, this person, Boudicca, led a rebellion against the Romans as well. And Boudicca, whether she lived or not, no one is quite sure, but the legend of Boudicca is one of those stories that has resonated and rung through the years in Britain. Boudicca was a queen, and when her husband died, the Romans took her land, they abused her and her daughters, and she, in revenge, rose up, bringing the tribes around her into open conflict with the Romans, destroying many of the Roman cities, killing thousands of Roman civilians and soldiers before finally being beaten herself. And an interesting little story about this, one of the Roman legions, which is the soldiers, which was based in Exeter in the southwest of Britain, all of those legions were called into action to defeat Boudicca. The commander of the Roman soldiers in Exeter, he thought that Boudicca was going to win. So he decided not to go and help. What a bad mistake. Because after Boudicca was beaten, he was next in line for the chop for not having brought his legion to fight. And the legion itself lost its title because of their cowardice, alleged. That statue is in London, and of course you can see it symbolises this great warrior queen. So rebellions existed, but by around about 100, England and Wales was basically at peace. Now in this map you see the location of the future Hadrian's Wall, the location of another wall even further north, which you may not have heard of, called the Antonine Wall. But what I want to draw your attention to is the network of towns and roads that had running through the country. The Romans had built these. So within 50 or 60 years, Britain had gone from that Celtic community that I told you about to this advanced civilization with roads and cities and towns. Most British people, most Celts, probably didn't have much to do with the Romans. They would have carried on living in those round mud huts. But if you were wealthy, then you would buy into the Roman way of life. This was a classic Roman trick. Once they had established their rule, they would invite the wealthy and powerful local people to adopt Roman customs, Roman lifestyles, so they would have a reason to support the Romans. And amongst the features of Roman rule, towns. You remember I showed you that picture of a village with little mud huts. Roman towns were beautifully planned, with the forum and basilica here where government would take place, the theatre, temples, the public baths, the Colosseum or amphitheatre, often outside the town, the villas and houses and shops that would be organised on this grid pattern of roads. And this is a very typical layout for Roman towns across the whole empire. You could get a villa. This is the height of luxurious living. That would look out and wouldn't look out of place in Italy or on the Mediterranean or in Florida. These were the homes of the wealthy. Fine dining, amazing decoration, slaves to look after your every need, flowing water, baths. Fantastic, high society. And wealthy Britons would buy into this. One of them, the wealthiest and perhaps most powerful of the lot, was a man called Cogidubnus. What a great name. Cogidubnus. And this is Fishbourne Palace, which was built for him, probably, by the Romans as a thank you for bringing the tribes of southern England into Roman rule. And this inscription, which you see here, it says, in the temple of Neptune and Minerva, by order of the leader Tiberius Claudius Cogidubnus, and this was actually built by a guild of engineers as a thank you to Cogidubnus. And we know that he's bought into Roman life because his name, Cogidubnus, is a Celtic name, but he has adopted the name Tiberius, who was the second Roman emperor, and Claudius, who was the emperor who conquered Britain. So he has a British name, Cogidubnus, but he's taken on two Roman names to show how he has bought into Roman society, Roman culture. Defining feature of Roman rule, the baths, the place to talk, to plot, to wash, to exercise. And in every Roman town in Britain, public baths would be built. There were exercise yards, there were hot, cold and warm pools to bathe in, swimming pools, massage parlours, shops, restaurants, cafes, fantastic. And Romans would go there every day. Rich Romans would have private baths built in their villas. And of course, the city of Bath in England, because of the baths. And this was a public bath built around a natural spring, which was dedicated to the god Sulis Minerva. A British god, Sulis, and the Roman god Minerva joined together to form Sulis Minerva, and these baths became a tourist attraction. People from all over Roman Britain would travel to Bath to spend days taking the waters and enjoying the relaxation that they would have. All this fresh water has to come from somewhere, and of course Roman aqueducts. This one actually is in Spain. There's nothing as extravagant as that in Britain, because Britain being such a wet country, there wasn't really a need to have these sorts of aqueducts built. But they would bring fresh running water into the towns. And of course the Romans are famous for their roads. This is a road in central England, and you can see the construction of this road, 2,000 years old. And these roads would bring communication, goods, people, and most importantly, soldiers could travel quickly around the empire. In fact, a map of Britain today shows Roman roads in green have now been turned into motorways and ordinary roads. So when we drive in England and Wales, if you drive any distance, you will almost certainly drive along a Roman road. This is how advanced they were, and I suspect probably there were fewer potholes then than there are now. And finally, to mention another thing, the amphitheatre. The Romans loved their sport. It was very bloodthirsty. Lots of people fighting and often killing each other. This one is in Italy, but here are the remains of an amphitheatre in a city called Caerleon in South Wales. So that's a bit about Britain after the Romans have been there about 70 years. But we're going to watch a little film now, because we've talked about the south, the places where the British tribes gave in to the Romans very quickly. There was another part of Britain, the north. I'm a northerner, and northerners are angry people and they don't like being told what to do. Well, that was the same 2,000 years ago. The Brigantian tribes, and the Scots or the Picts, they just did not want the Romans. And the land in the north was a land of mountains and mist and swamps and lakes and wild people and magic and wizards and monsters. And whenever the Romans tried to conquer those parts, it always ended badly for them. Imagine yourself as a Roman soldier being told you are going into Caledonia to fight the Picts. You would have been confident, but also a little bit terrified. It ended badly for them. Now, that particular story is about the 9th Legion, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will spot that instead of 1x meaning 9, this is V1111. Now, you might not know Roman numerals. The Romans used both forms to represent this. But this legion, the 9th Hispana or Spanish Legion, was in Britain at the time of the invasion in 43 AD or CE, but at 100 it disappears from the record. Across the empire it disappears from the record in about 120 CE. No one knows what happened to it. One of the stories is that it marched into Scotland and was wiped out. I think the Scots certainly like to cling on to that one. Whether it's true or not is very, very difficult to say. But a legion is 20,000 soldiers. So if that is the case, you can see why the Romans were terrified of Scotland and northern England. So then we get to this character, the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was born in Spain to a wealthy family that was from Italy. And he was very lucky that his marriage was to the niece of the Emperor Trajan. So he set himself up pretty well. He was many things: ruthless, Within a week of becoming emperor, he killed 4 members of the senators purely to make a point. He was conceited. He was unhappily married, but he was a very good linguist, including being fluent in English. And he was also a pragmatist, in other words, somebody who could understand what could and could not be done. This is the Roman Empire when he became emperor. Now, just to put into, for those of you who maybe are not familiar, Rome is here, right in the middle of the empire. There's Britannia, and then you can recognize, I hope, modern Spain, modern France, modern Switzerland, North Africa and the Middle East, Turkey, Syria. It's a huge empire. Perhaps 75 to 100 million people lived in that empire at this time. One man could not rule this empire on his own. The simple fact of getting information and instructions and people around the empire, it would take weeks for that information to get across. Soldiers based in Britain would never go to Rome. They would have no idea what the emperor looked like. They would have no direct contact with him. So Hadrian decided it was time to stop expanding or growing the empire. He visited Britain in 122 AD and he said, "Build a wall." As he put it, Romanos a barbaris discedere, which means to separate Romans from barbarians. So he's ordered the wall to be built to mark the edge of the empire. The place chosen for it is across the narrowest part of what is England. Makes sense. From sea to sea, around about 75 miles, which I think is about 120 kilometers. Makes sense. The other reason it made sense to build it there was because it was high land, high ground, and so the wall could look down on the north. And the other factor is that there was already a road built across England called the Stane Gate. That already existed. And that fort, Vindolanda, which will feature in our story, had already been built. So it was a perfect location for the wall, and that is where they decided to build it. This map shows you the wall as it was built, from, at one end, the wonderfully named Wall's End, or you could say the wall's beginning, couldn't you, depending on how you look at it, across to a place called Bowness, and in fact it was extended down to Maryport here in a slightly lesser form. Each of these black squares is a fort. And what I really think is interesting is that there are forts north of the wall. And that tells us that the purpose of this wall was not just to keep the nasty Scots and Picts out. It had a much more symbolic purpose. It marked Rome. Imagine the wall at about 5 to 6 meters in height, painted white, stretching high above the landscape for 75 to 80 miles. It would have dominated everything around it. It would have been a symbol. Rome is here, and Rome is here to stay. So the local people could be in no doubt who was in charge. It's a big sign saying, "You are now entering Rome." That was probably its main function, because it was almost impossible to defend every bit of the wall. and at night time, people could climb over the wall very, very easily. It's this symbol of Rome. Now, I want to show you an interesting map here. This map is a modern, what we call ordnance survey map of a part of Britain. You can see the wall is marked here by these red squares stretching along there. But what I want you to notice are all these circles, and inside it, it says Roman camp or Roman fort. Those were temporary workers' camps. The soldiers would build these camps, and they would live in them for weeks or months at a time while they were building the wall. And they are stretched all the way across, hundreds of these temporary workers' camps. And if you look at the number, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them in a very small area, each probably with maybe 100 or so soldiers living in them. And every day they would pick up their tools and they would walk up to the wall and they would dig stones and wood and earth and they would build a wall, and then they'd move on to the next camp and carry that on. Because it was the soldiers who built the wall. They were the young, fit, strong, available, and used to taking orders. Now then, on the wall, every 20 or so miles there would be a fort, and they all looked like this, exactly the same. The Romans loved things to be the same. They were usually about 20 miles apart, which was a day's march. And inside it, you can see this is the villa that would be inhabited by the commander of the fort, so he gets a big house. The barrack rooms where the soldiers would live. The hospital here. The grain stores where they would keep their winter corn. Toilets, communal toilets, I'm afraid, down here. Always at a point where the water would run out and down the hill, usually into the village and the houses of the locals. We've got stables here for horses, the headquarters building, and there would be exercise yards, football pitches, you name it, it was all in there. Every mile, there was a mile castle, aptly named, and the mile castle would have a gateway running through the wall, and perhaps 20 soldiers would live here, and their job was to check vehicles going through, checking wagons, taking taxes, making sure people weren't bringing things in illegally, controlling movement. Between each mile castle would be 2 towers. Each tower would be able to see the next door tower or mile castle, and about 6 to 8 soldiers would be there, and their job was simply to look out. Very, very boring job, looking out to see whether there were any invaders coming. This is a representation of how big the wall is based upon the foundations. There is nowhere on the wall where the full height still exists. But fascinatingly, it's been proven that the wall is actually longer east to west than it is west to east. There was something called the vallum. The vallum was a massive ditch that was dug to the south of the wall. And between the vallum and the wall, no civilians were allowed. It was a military exclusion zone. And this was one of the interesting things about the wall. Unlike the rest of England that was governed by the civilian leaders, the area around the wall was a military-controlled area. So how would you get across the vallum? Well, there were several crossing points, and incredibly, one of them is in somebody's back garden in a place called Benwell in Newcastle. And look at it. There is the vallum, the ditch. It's not as deep as it once was. You can see the incredible foundation work of the bridge crossing the vallum, the foundations of the road here, and these 2 plinths here where there would be an enormous gated archway going over that. And archaeology suggests that across the whole length of the 75-mile wall, there may only have been as many as a dozen crossing points. So locals who wanted to cross across the vallum would have to go to one of those points to get across. So that's a bit about what the wall looked like. I'm going to talk to you about who were the soldiers were there. Now, you may think the Roman soldiers were all from Rome. In fact, very, very few of them actually came from Rome itself. The Roman trick, whenever they conquered a place, was to bully, bribe, and force the local people to join the Roman army. It was cheap labor. They would promise them good pay, a roof over their heads, and after 25 years of service, Roman citizenship, which was a prized thing to acquire. So we know that, for example, there were people from Romania, Syria, Morocco, Switzerland, Belgium, Germany, the United States, all of these people living on or around the wall, these soldiers. And this inscription is actually a fascinating one because, whoops, beg your pardon. If you look at this curved sword here, this was a distinctive weapon of a group of people called the Dacians, and they lived in Romania, modern-day Romania. And it actually states on here, under the 4th of the Legion Augustus, the first cohort from the fort of Ilius or Ischis, I can't remember which it is, of Dacians, whose commander is Marcus Claudius Menander, tribune. So they put up a commemoration to their commander, but we know that they were from Romania, Dacians. In this one, this is even more fascinating to me. This one is a gravestone that was found in the fort of Arbea in North Shields. And look at the writing on the right that I've put here. To the spirits of the departed, and to Regina, his freed woman and wife, a Catavalonian by tribe, aged 30, Barates of Palmyra, put this up. Anybody know where Palmyra is? Starts with S and ends in Iria. Syria. Yeah, brilliant. Well done. Palmyra is in Syria. So Barates of Palmyra finds himself on the wall. Now, we don't know if he was a soldier or a trader, but it shows the multicultural life of the wall. And somehow, he has found a woman from the Catavalonian tribe in South England, has taken her as a slave, and later has freed her and married her. Remarkable how this interaction between people from around the empire with people from other parts of the empire, taking them as slaves and then later freeing them and marrying them. And we know that it's a freed woman as opposed to a free woman. That D is very important. Freed means they were once a slave. Another one here, to the spirits of the departed Victor, a Moorish tribesman, that's North Africa, age 20, the freed man of Numerianus, a trooper in the 1st Cavalry Regiment of Asturias, which are from Spain, who most devotedly conducted him to the tomb. Fascinating, too, to think that ordinary soldiers had slaves, and even some of the slaves had their own slaves. So that gives us a bit of a picture of this multicultural population that lived on the wall. Now, the Romans had their gods. They loved their gods. Here are 3. Anybody want to shout out who they think that one on the left might be? Jupiter. Brilliant. Well done. Jupiter, best, or greatest and best, as he was called. He was the king of the gods, and to all Romans, particularly soldiers, they would always pray to Jupiter before setting off on any journey. Jupiter would protect them. I suspect I'm going to have to say, don't shout out the same person. What about this guy? It's the god of war. Do you know his name? Yes, but for the Romans it would be Mars. Yeah, Mars, the god of war. And of course, soldiers would absolutely worship Mars. And on the right-hand side, anybody? Anybody? It's Venus. Now, Venus is the god of love and beauty, but the Romans had an additional job for her, if you like, which was good government. So in almost any Roman city or town, you would find temples to these three. And despite the fact that Jupiter was greatest and best, as he was known, I think for most Romans, particularly soldiers, Venus had a very strong role because she represented the security and strength that Roman government brought. But the great thing about the Romans was that they worshipped many gods. So wherever they went in the world, the very first thing that the soldiers would do is find out who were the local gods. Who were the gods who would make your life good or bad wherever you were based? Because there would be gods, and we need to find out who they are. Here is an incredible engraving found in the fort of Bird Oswald on the wall. And these were the mother goddesses. Look at what they're wearing. They're like the sort of waterproof plastic coats you get when it starts raining, you know, when people come out and give you those bits of plastic that don't keep you dry. Well, these are very classically British or Celtic clothing. And these are local British gods that Roman soldiers have started to worship. Because the locals would say, well, you don't want to annoy the mother goddesses, and the Roman soldiers would therefore start to worship them. On this altar, it's quite worn away, but the writing at the top says it's actually Mars Cocidius. Two gods. Mars, the god of war, Roman god. Cocidius, a local god in a very small part of the wall, who, when the Romans spoke to the locals, they described Cocidius in a way that sounded a bit like Mars. So for the Romans, this must be Mars in a different form. So they called him Mars Cocidius. This is a Mithraic temple. It's found at a place called Broccolita, a few hundred meters south of the wall, and it was buried for 1900 years until a farmer decided to drain his land, and this temple emerged. I'm embarrassed to say that my dog, Basil, once disgraced himself inside the temple. Fortunately, Mithras wasn't watching. Mithras was an Eastern god associated with men and soldiers. So this was very much the place that the lads would go to do a bit of praying to Mithras. And Mithraic temples have been found throughout Britain. But I think you can see here, a remarkable testament to the way that the Romans brought their gods with them, as well as finding the local gods. And finally, this lady, Coventina, a goddess of fields and nature, and you can see a water lily and water flowing from a bucket or something to her left. A British goddess that the Romans would never have heard of until they got to the wall, but so terrified of gods were they that they built this altar to her. So that tells us a bit about religion for the Romans. Now, one of the most remarkable finds on the wall are these, the Vindolanda tablets. These are very, very thin bits of wood upon which you can see writing, Latin. They were found in the fort of Vindolanda, chucked in the ground, probably when some little soldier had been told to clear out the filing cabinets, and he just ditched them, and he put them in a place where the local soil conditions have preserved them. And they give amazing insights into the ordinary lives of ordinary Romans. For example, this one. remarkable because it is almost certainly the first or earliest ever proven handwriting by a woman anywhere in the world. And this tablet says as follows: to Claudia Severus, on the 11th of September, to my dear Lepidina, please come to my birthday party. It will make my day more enjoyable. Send my greetings to your Aelius, my Cerealis, and my little son send theirs. It was sent by the wife of a Roman officer commanding a fort to the wife of another commander commanding Vindolanda fort, asking her to come to her birthday party. Just imagine these possibly 16, 17, 18-year-old women brought out of Rome, because these were the powerful, the officers, the top leaders, brought out of Rome, sent to the wall in this wild land, living amongst 400, 500 brutish, rough soldiers, with nobody else around her. It is no wonder that she wanted friendship and company. And it gives us that insight into what life was like for them, living on that wall. This one is a list of soldiers from Vindolanda. It's very difficult to see, of course, saying where they were. 300 or so of them were in a local town a few miles away. And it's difficult to know what they were doing, but my guess is they were probably on having a weekend off, and they were going to let their hair down in the bright lights of what is now Corbridge in Northumberland. That was the local hotspot. It lists 296 soldiers being in the fort in Vindolanda, and as is the way with soldiers, 50 of them were on the sick. They're listed as being in the hospital. One is even listed as being in London, probably sent on duty there. Again, it gives us this sort of mundane picture of life along the wall. There are even tablets, one of which is sent in what sounds like desperation by the commander of a garrison somewhere, and it literally says, urgently need more beer. You can imagine this poor centurion with maybe 30 or so soldiers who are getting really difficult to lead because the beer has run out. It doesn't sound too different to what you might see today. And in another one, we find an individual has received a letter saying, we will send 2 pairs of sandals, a pair of socks, and 2 pairs of underpants, called sublicalicum or something, which answers the long mystery of what did Romans wear under their togas. Now this is a fascinating thing, because this is a cup found in London, and it has pictures and inscriptions of the wall, which has led people to speculate that it's like the tourist rubbish you get when you visit, I don't know, a little Eiffel Tower or a London bus keyring or something. This is the equivalent, potentially. Somebody has visited the wall and they said, oh, well, that's a nice bit of Hadrian's wall tat. I'll take that home with me. It might not be that, but it's an interesting speculation. What about life for people who lived around the wall? Well, here is Vindolanda, and the fort is here. This is the fort on this side. This is what is known as the vicus, the village. What do soldiers have, do you think, anybody, that local people want? What do you think? Yeah, money, exactly. Soldiers have money. And you see it throughout history. Whenever soldiers arrive somewhere and stay, local people gather round, because they know that the soldiers are going to get bored, they've got money, they like doing things with that money, usually involving beer. So why wouldn't you come and set up shop, literally, and start to sell things to the soldiers? And over time,
these villages become established communities in themselves. And in this one you can see there is the public baths there. My guess is that the soldiers would have used them and probably not been so keen on the locals getting involved. We have evidence that the Romans called the British, this is interesting, they called them Britonculi, which basically means little Britons. So it was an insulting comment about the Britons, where they obviously thought they were a bit sort of, we don't want to mix with them. So the baths, a tavern here. One of the most fascinating finds in the tavern is a glass cup that comes from the south of France, telling us about the trade and movement that went on. We have houses for the locals, a market, and there is evidence of a butchery and a bakery there, and of course lots of temples. Now one of the things, and this, next one, is a representation of the vicus at Housted's fort. So you can see the wall running along there, Housted's fort, and then here is the village that is built up. Look at the permanence and the method of construction of these buildings, very modern buildings. Over time, the Roman soldiers would start to move and live in the village because, against the law, they would marry local people. Now, when I say against the law, soldiers, in theory, had to have the emperor's permission to get married. But if you're 2,000 miles away from Rome, is anybody really going to enforce that rule? No, absolutely not. So Romans would form relationships with and marry local British women, and probably 100, 200 years later, the soldiers actually in the fort are about as Romanian or Swiss as I am. By that stage, they're 7th, 8th generation British. For the locals, going through the wall was this difficult bit of having to pay taxes, make your bribes, talk to the local soldiers, etc. And this is the only existing example of where you can see the remains of one of the arches. And so it tells us you can picture that archway with a gate wide enough for a carriage being pulled by horses to go through. The wall was not built along any territorial lines, so if you were a local British farmer, you might have had land and cattle on both sides of the wall. So you'd have to go backwards and forwards across the wall. And here is a mile castle. You can see you'd be going through this wall, paying taxes, possibly bribing the guards, and the soldiers would become like local community policemen because they'd get to know each other, over the years. Okay, so finally we're going to look at the legacy of the wall. What has the wall left us? Because physically, it's not like the Great Wall of China. Okay, in some places there is nothing there at all, and in others it's not much more than sort of shoulder height to me, with grass running along the side and the foundations of some of the forts. But I think some of the legacies are found in the place names around the wall. Headon on the wall tells you exactly what it is, so there's no messing with that name. Wall's End, and the fort there, Segedunum, was the end of the wall. And Wall's End Boys Club, the football club, has its origins in a Roman gymnasium. There's a place called Wallish Walls. So it's a place that's a bit like the wall. It's called Wallish Walls. Have to say, there is a lot of suggestion that actually it is a misunderstanding of Welsh walls, representing a form of dry stone walling, but I like Wallish Walls being it's a bit like the wall, but not that much. Wall, there's a town called Wall. No imagination there. And even Newcastle itself takes its name from the fact that if it's the new castle, there must have been an old castle. And the old castle is Segedunum. What else? Well, The word Chester in any English town comes from the Latin castrum, meaning castle or fort. So, Ebchester, about a mile from where we live, a Roman fort. Lanchester, a Roman fort. Chester-le-Street, a Roman fort. And these are all places where we know the Romans built forts, and they remain in our geography today. Hadrian remains the most popular name for boys born in Newcastle today. There is a bus called the 122, the year that Hadrian's Wall was built, which runs across the wall. Hadrian Road is a station. And there's even a building company called Hadrian Construction. There you are, Hadrianus Aedificator. In some places, the local Geordies, who love a bit of humour, they actually put the sign up in dual language, English and Latin. So, noi fumare, no smoking. Suggestus 1, platform 1, I'm not sure where that word's come from. And even here, I love this, welcome to the metro. They've gone through the entire thing and translated it all there. Gratias agimus omnibus per metronum iter facient. I don't see what that says there. Thank you for travelling by metro. So if you're from Italy and you come here, you'll feel at home. I love that sign on the left-hand or western end of the wall. It tells you Maryport, which is the end of the fortifications that way, Wallsend that way, and Rome, 1,150 miles away. That would make you feel at home, wouldn't it? Just before we get on to now seeing whether you've picked up what the deliberate mistakes were, I want to leave you with this, which is Sycamore Gap on Hadrian's Wall. It is probably the most famous shot across the wall. If you've ever watched the film, pretty ghastly film, but anyway, if you've watched it, Robin Hood with Kevin Costner and Morgan Freeman, that's it. There is a bit where they've got off the boat in Dover on their way to Nottingham and have ended up on the wall, so there's something wrong with their map reading there if they've gone that far north. But it is so iconic. Sycamore Gap. Unfortunately, some idiot chopped it down about 2 years ago, and so it is now Sycamore Gap without the sycamore, which caused, I can't tell you, the anger that was unleashed in the north of England because of that. But it remains, I think, as one of the most iconic shots of the wall. So in summary, before I ask you whether you can get those false facts, the wall has lived in English folklore, and particularly in the north of England, for 2,000 years now. It stands as a monument, a testament to Roman ingenuity, determination, conquest, but ultimately failure. Because what the wall could not do was protect Britain from the barbarians, the Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes, the Picts, the Celts, and all those people who came in and finally kicked the Romans out. And it is a measure of how much the locals despised the Romans that within a few years of them leaving, the wall had been savaged for stone to build other buildings, and all the baths and roads and towns and amphitheatres and villas fell into ruin within a few generations. It was almost as if the British people, the Britunculi, said, thank you very much for your civilization, but we are going back to living in mud huts and wallowing around in squalor. Right. Thank you all very much. I want to see now, who can hands up anything that I said that was not true? Anybody? Yes, go on. Oh, right, okay. Yeah, that was... that. Fair enough. All right, one to you. Yeah, I'll get that. Go on, yeah, said?
When you said they gathered soldiers from USA.
Oh, good one, yes. There are no soldiers from the USA. We didn't want them. No, the United States did not exist. Correct. Yes?
The Romans, there's no socks.
Oh, now he says no socks. Who agrees with that? No socks. They did have socks, actually. They found remains of socks.
So they did have socks, yeah. Anybody else got anything? Come on, surely. Yes. Lady in blue. Correct, he didn't speak English. If you remember, I'd said only 5 minutes before there was no English language at that point. So Hadrian spoke many languages, but not English. Nobody spoke English. Anybody else? Yes, Anne. Good point. Hadrian, it cannot be longer east to west than west to east, can it? I put that in because I fell for that. I was doing a walk for charity across the wall, and one of my colleagues said, "Why are you going west to east? It's shorter east to west." And for about 10 minutes, I thought, "Oh, right, I'll change the route." Anybody else? Patrick. Oh, yeah, you're right. It's only second most popular. No, absolutely. Hadrian's name is not I don't know anybody called Hadrian, so I'm not sure that it's popular anywhere. Yeah, good one. Anything else? Yeah, Dave, I think. No football pitches in the. They were outside the forts, not inside the forts. Correct. No football pitches. I think there was one other. I think. Yes. Yes. Well, that's a good point. Yes, yeah, I wouldn't protect the Roman Empire. That was, yes, yeah, that was right. I think there was one more. Go on, Anne. Pardon? No, he did. He brought elephants. Claudius did bring elephants. Yeah, he brought elephants. Claudius was a conceited emperor, as many of them were. Why go to Britain without elephants when you could go with them, basically? They weren't used in battle, but I think it was 7 elephants he took with him. Go on, Ollie. It's true. Yeah. Oh dear, Mr. Scott, history teacher, who had actually spent 3 years in the Northeast when he was at university. Yes. The existence of what, sorry? No, Londinium did not exist in tribal times. The only city, or the only place that we would recognize that did exist was Camalodunum, which is today Colchester, and that was the capital of the Trinovantes tribe, and they were the tribe that's where Claudius went with his elephants. Londinium was not the capital of the Roman province of Britain until a few years later. Initially it was Camalodunum, but that got wiped out by Boudicca, along with St Albans and London. I'm sure there's one other. Just one second. Maybe not. Fluent in English. No. Missed that. No, I think we've got them. Yeah, we've got them. Right, there we are. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them, but you may feel that that's sufficient. If so, that's the case. But has anybody got any questions? If not, you can ask me afterwards. Anybody got anything to ask? Ooh, doesn't look like it. Okay, well, I hope that what you've learned this evening is a little bit about, for me, it's about the ordinary lives of people on the wall, not the big stories of emperors and battles and wars. It's about the people who spent their days living there, whether they were soldiers, the wives of the commanders, whether they were slaves, local British people. They had to get on with their lives, and it was mainly pretty boring because they weren't fighting all the time. They were just walking up and down and trying to pass the time. And I think this is what sometimes we forget, that in the sweep of history, when you look at all the big stuff that's going on, it's what's going on underneath. It's what we do every day that gets lost to history, which is why what we can discover from the wall is so interesting. There we are. Noli Fumari, and thank you very much.